I never thought my own daughter would steal from me. For most of my life, I believed family meant safety, that blood meant trust. When Emma offered to handle my savings after my husband passed, I was grateful. She said it was for my own good, that I shouldn't worry about bills or taxes anymore. I signed the papers she gave me and didn't think twice. But last week the IRS called and asked why I had unpaid taxes on accounts I didn't even know existed. That's when I realized Emma wasn't protecting me, she was using me. My name is Helen Moore, and for most of my 72 years, I've lived a quiet, careful life. My husband Frank was a steady man who believed every dollar should have a purpose. We saved, planned, and sacrificed, hoping to leave behind a little comfort for our daughter. After he passed, I felt lost, trying to manage things alone. Numbers never made sense to me the way they did to Frank. When Emma offered to help, it felt like a blessing I didn't deserve. She always spoke with such confidence, and I wanted to believe she meant well. Emma came over almost every weekend. At first, she'd bring groceries, tidy up the mail, and set my pills in neat little rows. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have such a responsible daughter. She'd talk about markets, investments, and taxes like they were household chores. I'd nod and smile, trusting her completely. It felt good not to worry about checks or bank statements. She told me she'd combine everything online to make it easier. I didn't ask questions. I was proud she was handling what I never could, and that pride blinded me more than I realized. After a few months, Emma started talking about streamlining my accounts. She said it would prevent mistakes if everything ran through one platform. She printed a few pages, showed me where to sign, and said she'd take care of the rest. I barely read them. The words blurred together, and I didn't want to seem ungrateful. She smiled, kissed my forehead, and told me I'd never have to worry about money again. I believed her, thinking it was love guiding her. Looking back, it wasn't love that made me sign those pages. It was loneliness, dressed as trust. One afternoon, I mentioned the papers to my neighbor, Mr. Lyle. He used to be an accountant before retiring. His face tightened when I said Emma managed everything now. He told me softly that mixing family and money often ends badly. I laughed it off, saying Emma was too kind for that. He didn't argue, just looked at me the way a man looks at a storm he knows is coming. That night, I lay awake longer than usual. His words echoed quietly in my mind, but I pushed them aside. Doubting my daughter felt like betrayal. Months passed, and I stopped getting my monthly bank envelopes in the mail. Emma said everything was digital now, that the paper statements were outdated. She promised she'd show me the new online setup, but she never quite did. I wasn't comfortable with technology, so I didn't press her. Instead, I started to rely on her word more than the numbers. Every time she told me things were fine, I believed her. It felt easier that way. Trust became my shortcut around confusion, but the longer I avoided the details, the more I felt a strange distance forming between us. Emma bought me a tablet one day, wrapped neatly in silver paper. "You can use this to see everything," she said. Already logged into all the accounts. The screen looked complicated, filled with apps and charts I didn't understand. She assured me everything was in order. The same amount each month, stable and safe. But after a while, I noticed the balance never changed. No matter what day I checked, it was always the same number, down to the cent. I thought maybe that was normal. Still, a quiet voice inside whispered that something wasn't right. One morning, a thick envelope arrived, with the bank's logo on it. I started to open it, but Emma snatched it gently from my hand. "Just more tax paperwork," she said, smiling too quickly. "I'll handle it." Then she slipped it into her purse and changed the subject. That moment stayed with me. The smile on her face looked practiced, not real. I wanted to ask her what was inside, but I didn't. Maybe I was afraid of the answer. Maybe I didn't want to know what I'd find if I looked too closely at my own child. The house started to feel emptier with each visit. Emma came less often, saying work kept her busy. When she did come, she seemed distracted, always checking her phone, rushing through conversations. I missed the way she used to laugh, how she'd hum while cooking. Now it was silence and small talk. I began to wonder if I had done something wrong. When I called her at night, she'd answer briefly and hang up before I could ask about the bills. I told myself she was tired, not distant. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. One evening, the lights flickered, and the power went out for half an hour. As I searched for candles, I found an old box at the back of the closet. Inside were dusty envelopes, old photos, and a stack of postcards from years ago. One was from Emma, at age 16, written in sloppy handwriting. "Don't worry, Mom. When I grow up, I'll take care of you." I stared at that promise for a long time, the ink faded but clear enough to hurt. It felt like finding a letter from a different lifetime, from a girl who no longer existed. The next morning, Emma called, saying she wanted to talk about reinvesting my money. Her tone was brisk, professional, not warm. She said some accounts weren't earning enough, and that she could move things around. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. When we hung up, I tried checking the tablet again, but the screen asked for a password I didn't have. It wasn't mine anymore. I realized how much control I had handed over without even noticing. That day, I felt something new, fear mixed with embarrassment, like I had willingly walked into my own trap. Later that week, I overheard my neighbor's grandson talking about seeing Emma downtown. He mentioned she was getting into a brand new car, laughing with her husband. They were heading to dinner at one of those expensive places you see in magazines. I didn't want to believe it was bought with my money, but the thought wouldn't leave me. I told myself she deserved nice things. She worked hard. Yet when I opened my fridge that night and saw the same cheap leftovers I'd been stretching for days, something inside me began to harden. I tried calling Emma to ask about the bank letters again, but she brushed me off, saying she'd explain everything soon. The way she said it made me uneasy. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my husband's old calculator. It still worked, though the buttons stuck. I punched in numbers just to feel like I was doing something, but they meant nothing without context. I missed having someone to lean on, someone who'd tell me what was real. Trusting Emma had felt like keeping a piece of Frank alive. Now it just felt like denial. A few days later, another letter came, this one with the IRS seal. My stomach twisted before I even opened it. It mentioned irregular activity and missing tax payments on investments I didn't know existed. My name was on it, but none of it made sense. I folded it back neatly and hid it in a drawer. For the rest of the day, I pretended everything was fine. I cooked, watched television, even watered the plants. But my hands shook the entire time. Something inside me had cracked, though I still wasn't ready to admit it out loud. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the ticking of the old clock in the hallway. Each sound felt heavier, slower, like it was counting down to something. I thought about Emma's teenage postcard again, her promise to take care of me. I wanted to believe that promise still meant something. But as the hours passed, I realized I didn't know my daughter anymore. The little girl who used to bake me birthday cakes was gone, replaced by someone colder, sharper. I didn't know when that change happened, only that it had. When the phone rang the next morning, I expected Emma. Instead, it was a polite voice from the IRS, asking to verify my identity. They said there were discrepancies tied to my accounts, and that someone might be accessing funds under my name. I felt the air leave my chest. I answered their questions carefully, heart pounding. When I hung up, the silence in the room was unbearable. I sat at the kitchen table, looking at the empty chair across from me, and whispered to no one, "What have you done, Emma?" After that call, I sat frozen for what felt like hours. My hands rested flat on the kitchen table, trembling slightly. Every word the agent said echoed in my mind. Discrepancies, unauthorized transfers, missing funds. It all pointed to someone I trusted completely. I didn't know what to do. My first thought was to call Emma, but something stopped me. If she really was behind this, calling her might make things worse. For the first time in my life, I decided to keep a secret from my own child. I needed to understand the truth before confronting her. That afternoon, I walked down to the bank myself. The clerk at the counter looked young, maybe 25. I handed her my ID and asked about my savings account. Her polite smile faded as she typed. Then she asked if I had recently transferred my funds to another institution. My heart sank. I told her I hadn't moved a single dollar. She glanced nervously at her screen and said my signature was on multiple transfer authorizations. I asked to see them, but she said they were digital. I thanked her quietly and left, trying not to let my knees give out. The air outside felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I stood near the bank doors, pretending to look for my car keys, though I hadn't driven there in years. I kept wondering how Emma got my signature. Maybe she scanned something. Maybe I'd signed one of her forms without reading. The world around me blurred, cars, people, even the sky. Everything looked distant, unreal. I took the long way home, hoping the walk would calm me. It didn't. I felt small again, like a child who had lost her way home and didn't know whom to trust. When I got home, I went straight to my husband's old desk. It still smelled faintly of his cologne. Even after all these years, I opened the drawers, searching for something, anything, that could help me make sense of what was happening. In the back corner, I found an old notebook filled with numbers he used to track our expenses. His handwriting was neat and steady. I ran my finger along the pages, thinking about how careful he was. If he were alive, this never would have happened. For the first time, I felt angry at both Emma and myself. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Emma's smile, warm on the surface, hiding something underneath. Around 2 in the morning, I sat at the kitchen table and took out the IRS letter again. I read every word slowly, this time understanding more. It mentioned investments, transfers, and offshore accounts tied to my name. My stomach turned. I decided then that I wouldn't be quiet anymore. I didn't know how to fight this, but I wasn't going to sit and wait for someone else to fix it. I owed myself that much. The next morning, I found Mr. Lyle tending to his roses. His garden was always perfect, every flower in its place. I told him I needed to ask about something private. He invited me in, and I showed him the IRS letter. He adjusted his glasses and frowned. "This isn't just confusion, Helen," he said. "Someone's been moving your money." My throat tightened. I asked him what I should do, and he told me to gather every paper I could find, bank letters, receipts, anything with my name. I went home and started a pile on the dining table. By evening, the table was covered in papers. I didn't understand half of what I was looking at, but I kept sorting, trying to find patterns. Emma's name appeared on a few documents, sometimes as authorized signatory. That word sounded harmless, but I knew now it wasn't. I noticed transfers with strange account numbers and dates that matched when she said she was fixing my taxes. My chest hurt, but I kept reading. Every page felt like a betrayal spelled out in ink. I realized the truth wasn't hiding anymore. It was staring at me in black and white. I picked up my phone, planning to call Emma, but stopped when her photo appeared on the screen. Her smiling face suddenly looked unfamiliar, almost like a stranger's. I deleted the number from the dial pad and set the phone down. Instead, I called the IRS again, using the name from the letter. The same polite voice answered. I explained who I was, and that I wanted to understand what was happening. The agent said my case was being reviewed because of suspicious transfers under my social security number. That word, suspicious, made my stomach twist tighter. After I hung up, I sat in silence. Outside, I could hear the faint sound of a distant church bell, slow and steady. It reminded me of my husband's funeral, the same hollow tone that filled the air back then. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I missed his advice, his calm way of solving problems. I could almost hear his voice saying, "Helen, don't panic, just start with what you know." So I did. I made a list of everything Emma told me, and every lie I'd started to suspect. It was longer than I expected. 2 days later, another envelope arrived, this time stamped urgent. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I placed it next to the pile of papers I'd gathered. The sight of all those envelopes made my hands ache. It felt like they carried pieces of my trust inside them. Later that night, I finally tore it open. It was another IRS notice, this one mentioning possible fraud investigation. The words blurred as I read them. I wasn't sure what hurt more, the idea of losing my savings or the realization that my daughter was capable of doing this to me. When Emma called later that evening, her tone was unusually sweet. She asked how I'd been and said she was planning to visit soon. I tried to keep my voice steady, pretending I hadn't seen the letters. She mentioned needing me to sign a few final tax adjustments. The way she said it made my pulse quicken. I agreed, knowing I'd have to be careful. She said she'd come by the weekend. After we hung up, I stood in the middle of the living room, staring at the framed photo of us together. I wondered if that smile was ever real. The night before she arrived, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was happening behind my back. I went through the tablet again, clicking every app. One folder caught my attention. It was hidden under a simple name: Documents. Inside were emails between Emma and a brokerage firm. One message mentioned transferring funds into an account under her husband's business name. My hands shook as I scrolled through the attachments. It was all there. I took photos with my phone, not really knowing what I'd do with them yet. I just knew I had to keep them safe. When Emma arrived the next day, she looked polished and cheerful, dressed in a new coat I'd never seen before. She brought flowers and smiled like nothing was wrong. I forced a smile back, my heart pounding. We sat at the kitchen table as she pulled out more documents. She said it was just paperwork, but I could feel my throat tightening. I asked casual questions, testing her answers. She was smooth, too smooth. Every word sounded practiced. That was the moment I stopped pretending to myself. My daughter wasn't protecting me. She was protecting what she'd stolen. When she left, I waited until her car was gone, then called Mr. Lyle again. I told him I needed advice about lawyers. He hesitated before suggesting I speak to someone at the bank first, someone senior. I didn't want to cause a scene, but he said quietly, "Helen, you already have one." The next morning, I took the bus downtown and asked to speak with a manager. I explained my situation in plain words, my voice trembling. The manager looked sympathetic but said the signatures were legitimate. That word cut deep. I signed my own downfall without even knowing it. I thanked the manager and stepped outside, holding the railing for balance. The cold air felt like a slap. I realized Emma hadn't forged my signature. She didn't need to. She had simply asked for it, and I had given it freely. Shame burned in my chest. I'd always thought of myself as cautious, yet I'd been so eager to avoid loneliness that I handed away everything that mattered. The walk home felt endless. Every familiar corner looked different, as if the town itself knew what had happened. I kept my head down, hoping no one would see my tears. That night, I went through every drawer and box in the house. I found copies of old statements, scribbled notes, and even blank forms I didn't remember signing. It was like piecing together a puzzle that had already been completed by someone else. My head hurt from reading so many numbers. I finally gathered everything into a small folder and labeled it proof. The word looked strange in my handwriting. I placed the folder under my bed, next to a shoebox of old photos. I told myself that tomorrow I'd decide what to do next. Tomorrow had to be different. When I woke up, I felt an unfamiliar sense of focus. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about what Emma would say. I was thinking about what I needed to do. I started by writing a timeline of every major event since Frank died. Dates, calls, visits, everything. Seeing it on paper made the pattern clear. Each major financial change Emma made happened right after a family milestone. She'd used my grief as cover. I sat back in my chair, numb. It wasn't just money she'd taken. She'd taken advantage of the one thing she knew I couldn't lose: trust. Later that day, I went to the post office to send a certified letter to the IRS. The clerk helped me fill out the forms and explained how to track it. Her kindness made me emotional. I wondered how many older people had stood in that same spot, confused and embarrassed. When I got home, I put the receipt on the fridge where I could see it. It felt like a small victory, like I'd taken back a piece of control. For the first time in months, I felt less like a victim and more like someone waking up. That evening, Emma called again. She asked if I had checked the updated balances on the tablet. I lied and said yes, that everything looked fine. I wanted her to think I was still clueless. She seemed relieved and even cheerful. I hung up and turned off my phone. I realized how much she had relied on my ignorance. That was her weakness. She underestimated how much people notice when they're quiet. I decided I'd keep pretending until I knew everything. Pretending had hurt me once, but this time, it was my only weapon. The following morning, I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the street. My thoughts kept circling back to one question: when did Emma change? I remembered her first apartment, how proud she was, how she'd cry when money got tight. I used to slip her grocery cash without telling Frank. Maybe that's where it began. My need to protect her, even when she didn't deserve it. That pattern had followed us both into old age. I realized I'd spent years mistaking guilt for love. Now I was the one paying the price for that confusion. That afternoon, I decided to test her. I called Emma and told her the IRS had contacted me again. I expected panic, but she stayed calm, too calm. She said it must be a clerical issue and promised she'd fix it. I thanked her and hung up. 5 minutes later, she texted saying she'd be stopping by that weekend to sort things out. My hands clenched around the phone. I knew what she was really coming for. She wanted control back. What she didn't know was that she wasn't the only one preparing for that meeting. Before the weekend, I made copies of everything: letters, emails, statements, and stored them in different places around the house. One went under the sink, another inside a cereal box, one even taped under a chair. I wasn't taking chances. I also wrote a note to myself: if anything happens, call Agent Lewis, IRS. It felt strange writing my own safety plan, but it gave me peace. That night, I sat in the living room with the lights off, watching the shadows stretch across the walls. I wasn't just scared anymore, I was ready. When Emma arrived that Saturday, she looked tense. Her voice was still sweet, but her eyes kept darting around the room. She asked to see the IRS letters. I told her I didn't know where I'd put them. She smiled, saying she'd help me find them. For an hour, she searched drawers and cabinets, while pretending to make small talk. I stayed calm, pretending to forget where things were. When she finally gave up, her smile faltered. "Don't worry, Mom," she said softly. "I'll take care of it." But her voice trembled. For the first time, she looked nervous. After she left, I sat in the silence she'd left behind. The house felt colder somehow, heavier. I looked at the folder marked proof and thought about what came next. I knew I had enough to report her, but part of me hesitated. She was still my daughter, the same girl who once made me paper flowers for Mother's Day. I went to bed with my heart torn in two. Justice and love had never felt so far apart. I didn't know which side I'd choose when the time came. The next morning, I woke to find another message on my answering machine. It was the IRS again. The agent said the investigation had officially started and that I might be called for statements soon. I listened to the message 3 times, each word heavier than the last. I knew the line between truth and family had finally snapped. My hands felt steady as I deleted the message. The choice had already been made. I wasn't going to protect Emma anymore. It was time for her to face what she'd done. That night, I pulled out the old postcards again, the ones I'd found in the closet during the power outage. I spread them across the table, each one a small memory frozen in time. One from Emma when she was 12, thanking me for baking her birthday cake. Another from her college trip, saying she missed me. I picked one up and started to write on the back, as if answering her from another life. I didn't plan to send it. I just needed to remember what love once felt like before money turned it into something unrecognizable. The next morning, I walked to the library. I hadn't been there in years, but I needed to use their computer. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Sitting at the public desk, I created a small folder on a flash drive and labeled it Helen's Records. I uploaded the copies of every file I had: letters, photos, screenshots. The librarian smiled politely, unaware that I was storing pieces of my broken life on that tiny device. When I left, I slipped it into my coat pocket, feeling its weight like a quiet form of courage. Later that day, I stopped by the grocery store. I saw a woman about my age arguing with her adult son near the checkout line. He was scolding her for buying unnecessary things. She looked down, embarrassed, and handed him her wallet. Watching that, I felt a sharp ache in my chest. It wasn't just my story. It was something that happened to so many of us. We trusted our children with everything, not realizing that sometimes love can make us blind. I left the store without buying anything. I had seen enough reminders of my mistake for one day. That evening, Emma showed up unexpectedly. She looked restless, her smile too wide, her eyes darting toward the pile of papers on the counter. I acted surprised and invited her in. She said she was worried about the stress. All this was causing me. Her voice trembled slightly. I could tell she'd been getting calls she didn't expect. I offered her tea and kept my tone soft, just like old times. The calmness seemed to unsettle her. It was strange, realizing how power shifted when I stopped reacting. For once, she didn't seem so sure of herself. As we sat, she pulled out her phone and showed me a few forms, insisting I sign them again to fix the confusion. My heart raced, but my face stayed calm. I said I needed to find my glasses and walked into the other room. There, I quietly took my phone and pressed record before returning. She repeated everything she'd said before, even using the same excuses. I nodded, pretending to believe her. It felt almost cruel, but necessary. For years I had trusted her blindly. Now I was seeing her lies unfold in plain daylight. Halfway through our tea, the lights flickered again. A second later, the power went out completely. Emma cursed under her breath, fumbling with her phone's flashlight. I lit a candle and watched her face in the glow. It looked different now, sharp, worried, calculating. She said she'd checked the fuse box, but I knew she was looking for something else. When she disappeared into the hallway, I took her phone from the table. The screen was still open on an email thread. I snapped a quick photo before putting it back. My hands shook, but I didn't stop. When the lights came back on, she returned looking flustered. She forced a laugh and said the outage must have been citywide. I smiled back and said maybe it was just the house reminding us to slow down. The words seemed to rattle her. She left soon after, saying she had a meeting early tomorrow. I watched her car pull away through the window. That night, I checked the photo I'd taken of her email. It mentioned a transfer deadline and someone named McGrant. I didn't know who that was, but I knew I was getting closer. The next morning, I walked to Mr. Lyle's house with a small notepad in hand. I showed him the photo of Emma's email. His face darkened as he read it. He said Miss Grant might be a broker or accountant helping her move the funds. He told me to keep documenting everything, but not to confront her yet. Let her keep thinking you're confused, he said. I nodded, feeling both grateful and humiliated that I needed guidance like this. Still, it gave me purpose. For the first time in a while, I felt like I was fighting back. That night, I cooked myself a real dinner instead of something from a can. Small things like that started to feel important again. I ate slowly, thinking about how much energy it took to keep pretending. Every move had to be quiet, careful, patient. I kept my phone recording even when I spoke to her. I saved every voicemail, every text. I started writing notes about her tone, her pauses, her excuses. It was exhausting, but it kept me focused. The fear hadn't gone away, it had just turned into something sharper, something that felt almost like resolve. After dinner, I sat by the candlelight and opened my husband's old watch box. The ticking inside had stopped years ago, but I still wound it sometimes out of habit. I turned it over in my hands and thought about how steady he had been, how safe he made everything feel. The watch didn't move anymore, but it reminded me that time itself was still on my side. I wasn't done yet. I whispered to the empty room, promising him that I'd set things right, even if it took the last bit of strength I had left. The following day, I decided to make a visit to the post office again. I wanted to learn how to send documents that couldn't be tampered with. The clerk explained certified mail and tracking receipts, patient with every question. I sent duplicates of all my papers to the IRS address on the letters, making sure they'd arrive safely. When I left the counter, I felt lighter. Every small step mattered now. I had been so afraid of seeming foolish, but that fear was gone. I wasn't helpless anymore. I was a witness, and witnesses take notes. On the way home, I stopped by the park. The weather was cloudy, and children played by the swings. I watched a little girl fall and cry, only for her mother to rush over and help her up. It was such a simple act, trust still pure and untouched. I felt tears sting my eyes. Somewhere along the way, Emma had stopped seeing me as her mother and started seeing me as a resource. It was a painful truth, but also freeing. Once you stop expecting love to save you, you start saving yourself. That realization hurt, but it healed too. That night, I went through my folder again and noticed something strange. A few documents had similar email timestamps, but one was out of place, dated before Emma even told me she'd started managing my accounts. That meant she'd been planning this long before she said anything. My stomach tightened. It wasn't an accident, it was deliberate. I added the finding to my notes, marking it in red pen. I sat there for a while afterward, staring at the pages. The quiet in the house felt heavier than usual, almost like it was holding its breath with me. The next day, I called Emma and pretended I was confused about my insurance payments. I wanted to hear how she'd respond. Her voice was steady, but I caught a faint tremor when she said, "Don't worry, Mom. It's all under control." I told her I was thinking of calling the bank myself. There was a long pause before she said, "You don't need to do that." That silence told me everything. I thanked her and hung up. My pulse raced as I saved the call recording. It was proof not just of fraud, but of fear. Later that afternoon, Mr. Lyle introduced me to his nephew Mark, who worked part-time for a tax office. He agreed to look at my documents privately. A few days later, he called with what he'd found. My name appeared on several offshore transfers tied to a shell company. I didn't know what that meant until he explained it was money laundering. My knees went weak. Emma hadn't just taken my savings, she'd used my identity for something illegal. I thanked him and hung up, unable to speak for a few minutes. The betrayal had finally become something dangerous. I sat in my living room, staring at the wall. The sound of the refrigerator hummed softly in the background. I thought about calling the police, but my mind kept circling back to Emma's face as a child. It felt impossible to connect that little girl with the woman who had done this. My thoughts tangled between love and fury. I told myself that facing the truth didn't mean I stopped loving her. It just meant I loved myself enough to stop letting her hurt me. That line was hard to draw, but I drew it anyway. That night, I opened the window and let the cool air in. I could hear rain beginning to fall outside, steady and soft. The smell of wet pavement filled the room, the smell of change. I stood there for a long time, letting the rain soak the edges of the curtains. It felt cleansing, like the house itself was exhaling. I wasn't sure what would come next, but I knew I was done pretending this was a misunderstanding. The truth was heavy, but it was finally mine to carry. Somehow, that made me feel stronger than I'd been in years. The next morning, I woke up early and checked Emma's social media. Her husband had posted photos of them at a resort, both smiling beside a new car. The caption read, "Hard work pays off." My heart sank, but then anger pushed through the sadness. That hard work was my retirement, my trust, my entire future. I saved the photos as more evidence, labeling them with dates. It felt strange, collecting proof against my own child. But I wasn't doing this out of spite anymore. I was doing it so I could finally live free of her lies. That evening, I printed everything, emails, screenshots, letters, and locked them in my desk drawer. I added one final note to the folder. For the investigator. I didn't know when they would call, but I wanted to be ready. I double-checked the locks on my doors and turned off the lights. Before going to bed, I whispered a quiet prayer, not for Emma, but for clarity. I didn't want revenge. I wanted peace. For the first time, I believed that peace would only come after truth. I fell asleep with that thought, heavy but certain, resting beside me. The following morning, Emma came over without warning. She looked tense, her usual charm replaced with impatience. She asked why I hadn't returned her calls. I told her I'd been tired. Her eyes scanned the room, looking for something. I offered her tea again, keeping my voice calm. She started talking about confusing paperwork and said she'd fix everything soon. I nodded, letting her talk. Every word she said now sounded hollow, like a rehearsed speech. She didn't realize yet that I wasn't the same helpless woman she thought she could control. That realization would come soon enough. After she left, I took out my old diary and started writing down everything that had happened, not just the money or the lies, but how it all made me feel. I wanted to remember this moment, not as defeat, but as awakening. Each page became lighter to write, as if I was clearing space in my own heart. When I closed the book, I realized I was shaking, not from fear, but relief. There was something powerful about seeing the truth in your own handwriting. It made everything real, but also, finally, survivable. A few days passed quietly. Emma didn't call. I kept expecting some excuse, but silence hung heavy. I spent my mornings organizing the house, getting rid of clutter. It felt good to simplify, to reclaim my own space. One afternoon, as I was sorting through drawers, I found an old birthday card from Emma. Inside, she had written, "You always believed in me, Mom." I traced the words with my finger, wondering if that was still true. Maybe belief was the problem. Maybe I had believed too much, for too long, in someone who stopped deserving it years ago. Mr. Lyle stopped by to check on me. He brought muffins and sat across from me, his face kind but serious. He asked if I was ready for what might come next. I told him I didn't think anyone was ever ready for something like this, but I wasn't scared anymore. He nodded and said he was proud of me. That word proud made my throat tighten. For months I'd felt only shame, but hearing that made me realize I wasn't just a victim in this story. I was also the one rewriting how it would end. That night, I sat by the window again, as rain fell outside. The steady rhythm against the glass felt soothing. I thought about how many small moments had led me here, each missed question, each blind signature. Regret tried to creep in, but I pushed it aside. Regret wouldn't fix what was broken. Action would. I whispered to myself that tomorrow I would call the IRS investigator again and tell them everything. No more hesitation, no more fear. The house was silent, except for the rain, and for once, silence didn't feel lonely. It felt like strength. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The sky was still gray when I brewed coffee and dialed the number from the IRS letter. My hands didn't shake this time. When the agent answered, I calmly confirmed my identity and told them I was ready to cooperate fully. They thanked me and said someone would contact me soon for an official statement. When I hung up, I felt something inside me shift. I had done it. I had chosen truth over comfort, clarity over illusion. Whatever came next, I knew I could face it head on. 2 days later, the IRS called again. The agent's voice was calm but serious. They said they were now officially investigating my accounts for possible fraud and identity misuse. I listened carefully, answering every question as clearly as I could. The agent assured me I wasn't in trouble but asked that I avoid alerting anyone connected to the accounts. I knew what that meant. They were telling me not to warn Emma. I thanked them for their patience, hung up the phone, and sat back in my chair. My heart pounded, but this time it wasn't from fear. That evening, Emma called out of the blue. Her voice was cheerful but strained, as if she were trying too hard to sound normal. She said she'd been thinking about us taking a short trip together, maybe to get away from all the stress. I could hear her husband whispering something in the background. My gut told me this wasn't a vacation, it was a distraction. Still, I played along, agreeing to go. I wanted to see what she was planning. After hanging up, I packed a small bag, tucking the flash drive with all my evidence deep inside. When she arrived to pick me up, the car was spotless, smelling faintly of expensive perfume. She smiled brightly and said how nice it would be to spend time together again. I smiled back, pretending to be grateful. As we drove, I noticed she avoided eye contact, her hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly. The highway stretched ahead, quiet and endless. Neither of us spoke for a while. I watched the trees blur past and wondered if she ever realized how much silence could reveal. Every mile felt like a test, and I was finally ready to pass it. After an hour, we pulled up to a lakeside house I'd never seen before. It was beautiful. Glass windows, a stone porch, a small dock reaching out into still water. "Just a little place we're renting," Emma said, her tone light. But the way she said "we" made me uneasy. Inside, everything looked new. There were designer bags on the counter, a bottle of imported wine, and framed photos of her and her husband smiling. It didn't look rented, it looked lived in. My throat tightened. This was where my savings had gone into a life I was never meant to see. Emma poured us each a glass of water and talked about how hard she'd been working. She said she wanted to give me comfort in my old age, that she'd made smart investments. Her voice shook slightly, but she tried to cover it with confidence. I nodded, pretending to believe her. I glanced around the room again. The furniture, the decorations. Everything screamed money. My money. I realized this wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was pride disguised as kindness. She wanted me to admire what she'd built, to make me believe it was all for me. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling. The lake outside shimmered faintly under the moonlight. I could hear Emma talking softly on the phone in the next room. Her tone was urgent, clipped. Nothing like the calm daughter I once knew. I moved closer to the door and listened. She mentioned documents and timelines, and someone needing to be reassured. The pieces started falling into place. She wasn't planning a family trip. She was covering her tracks. I gripped the flash drive in my hand and whispered to myself that this would end soon. The next morning, I watched her through the window as she made phone calls by the lake. Her reflection shimmered in the glass, almost like two versions of her existed. The daughter I raised and the woman she became. When she came back inside, she smiled as if nothing was wrong. She offered to cook breakfast, but I wasn't hungry. I just nodded and sipped my coffee, watching her every move. I'd spent my whole life trusting her words. Now I was learning to read her silences instead. They told me everything I needed to know. After breakfast, she suggested we take a walk. The air was crisp, and the sound of birds echoed across the water. She kept talking about how grateful she was for me, how she just wanted peace. Each sentence sounded rehearsed. I asked her quietly if she was in trouble. She froze for half a second, then smiled and said no. That pause was all I needed. Truth always hesitates before it hides. I let the conversation drop, pretending to believe her. Inside, I was already making plans. I wasn't her pawn anymore. I was the one keeping score. Back inside, she mentioned needing to check something in the study. When she left the room, I followed quietly and peeked around the door. She was on her laptop, scanning files and deleting messages. I took out my phone and recorded the screen from a distance. My hands shook, but I didn't stop. Every click of her mouse was another nail in the coffin she'd built herself. When she noticed me, she smiled nervously and said she was just organizing things. I nodded and pretended not to care. Sometimes pretending is the strongest truth you can tell. That evening, she opened a bottle of wine and insisted I relax. I refused, saying water was fine. She laughed awkwardly and poured herself another glass. We sat in silence as the sun disappeared behind the trees. She talked about her future, about maybe moving abroad, about starting fresh. I realized then she wasn't planning to fix anything. She was planning to run. I excused myself early, saying I was tired. Behind the locked door of my room, I copied the videos I'd taken onto a second flash drive. No matter what she did next, I'd be ready. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my door. They stopped for a moment, then continued down the hallway. I sat up, holding my phone close. My pulse was steady, not panicked. I waited until I heard the front door close, then peeked through the curtain. Her car headlights flickered, once before vanishing into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I spent the rest of the night planning my next move, staring out at the quiet lake that had witnessed far too many lies. The next morning, I made coffee and sat outside on the porch. The air was cold enough to sting my fingers. When Emma came downstairs, she acted like nothing had happened. She asked if I'd slept well. I said yes, even though we both knew it was a lie. She talked about leaving soon, saying she had urgent work to handle. I nodded, sipping my coffee. Her words washed over me without meaning. I wasn't listening to her anymore. I was watching her unravel. Every sentence she spoke was a thread pulling loose from her own story. Before we left, I took one last look around the house. The luxury felt hollow now. The art on the walls, the expensive furniture, all of it seemed to mock what it had cost. I thought of the years Frank and I had spent clipping coupons and saving every spare penny. That money wasn't just numbers. It was our life's effort, and she'd turned it into decoration. I clenched my hands to keep them from shaking. When she called from the car, I said goodbye to the house, silently. It wasn't mine, but it was built on my sacrifice. On the drive back, She talked endlessly about real estate, taxes, and her plans to make things right. I kept my responses short, quiet, careful. She had no idea I was recording again. I caught every word, every nervous pause. The road stretched out endlessly, and I thought about how much distance existed between us now. When we finally pulled into my driveway, I felt a strange calm. She smiled, kissed my cheek, and said she'd call later. I watched her car disappear down the road, and for the first time, I didn't feel sad. I felt free. That evening, I stood by the window, watching the sunlight fade behind the houses. I thought about the lake, the lies, and everything that had brought me here. I wasn't angry anymore, just tired. Somewhere deep down, I still hoped Emma would choose to do the right thing, but I didn't depend on it. I had spent too many years believing in promises. Now I believed in proof. I brewed myself tea and sat in the quiet, realizing that peace doesn't always come with forgiveness. Sometimes it comes with understanding, and I finally understood everything. The next morning, I called the IRS agent again. I told them I'd collected new evidence and that I was ready to cooperate completely. They asked if I could send digital copies, so I mailed the flash drive that afternoon. Before sealing the envelope, I whispered a small goodbye to the woman I used to be, the one who trusted too easily. That version of me had served her purpose. The post office clerk smiled and handed me the receipt. I tucked it safely in my coat. It wasn't just paper, it was my first real act of justice. Days passed, quiet and steady. I spent the time cleaning, cooking, and waiting. I didn't tell anyone what was happening. The calm felt strange, but right. Then one evening, I saw an unfamiliar car slow down near my house. A man in a suit stepped out and knocked. He introduced himself as an IRS investigator. He thanked me for my cooperation and said they were following the money trail. He also asked me to keep silent until they finished their work. His presence felt like a turning point. For the first time, I knew this was almost over. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from me. For years, I had kept that chair untouched, as if saving it for Frank. Now it felt symbolic in a different way. It reminded me of all the space I had left open for Emma's honesty, waiting for her to fill it. She never did. I wasn't sure if that space would ever be occupied again, but at least I knew it no longer belonged to lies. It belonged to me, and that was enough. The next morning, my phone rang again. This time, it wasn't the IRS. It was Emma. Her voice sounded tight, panicked. She said something was wrong with her accounts, that the bank was freezing transfers. I kept my tone gentle and said I didn't know anything about it. There was a long pause before she muttered, "I'll call you later," and hung up. I set the phone down, staring at it for a moment. The storm she'd created had finally reached her doorstep, and I didn't have to lift a finger to make it happen. A few hours later, another letter arrived. An official notice confirming the ongoing audit. It said I might be required to testify if needed. The idea scared me at first, but then I thought about everything she'd taken. Fear didn't fit anymore. I folded the letter and placed it neatly beside my growing stack of documents. The pile looked like a strange kind of monument, one built from pain, persistence, and proof. I wasn't sure how the story would end, but I knew I was ready for whatever came next. The truth had already set me free. That evening, Emma showed up unannounced. Her car door slammed harder than usual, and she stormed into the house without knocking. Her eyes were red, her voice sharp. She accused me of talking to people and spreading lies. I stayed seated, calm as ever. I told her I didn't know what she was talking about. That only made her angrier. She said the IRS had contacted her and that she might lose everything. Her hands trembled as she shouted. I didn't respond. Watching her unravel felt both heartbreaking and inevitable. Actions always echo back to the one who caused them. After a long silence, she sank into the chair opposite me, her anger fading into exhaustion. She said she never meant to hurt me, that she was just trying to handle things better. Her excuses sounded smaller than ever. I looked at her and saw a woman who had built her life on fragile lies, now watching them collapse. I didn't argue or comfort her. I just listened. Sometimes silence speaks louder than forgiveness. When she finally looked up, Tears filled her eyes. But even then, I could see she wasn't crying for me. She was crying for herself. Eventually, she admitted she'd borrowed my money to pay off debts, promising she'd planned to return it all. I wanted to believe her, but the details didn't fit. I could see her avoiding eye contact, twisting her wedding ring nervously. She said she was scared of what might happen now. I told her quietly that actions always have consequences. My voice didn't tremble. I think that surprised her. She started crying again, begging me to understand. I didn't answer. Understanding wasn't what she needed anymore. Accountability was, and she was finally standing face to face with it. She left soon after, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the house like a final sentence being spoken. I didn't chase after her this time. I didn't call or cry. I just stood there, breathing deeply, realizing something had ended. The house felt both emptier and lighter, as if it had been holding its breath for months. I went to the window and watched her car disappear down the road. The sky was turning orange, soft, and quiet. For the first time, I didn't feel broken. I felt like someone who had survived. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything that had happened. I didn't know what the next few weeks would bring, but I wasn't afraid anymore. The truth had taken everything I once thought was stable and replaced it with something better. Clarity. Emma's choices were no longer mine to carry. As I drifted towards sleep, I heard faint thunder in the distance. It sounded like the world was finally settling, clearing itself of old storms. I closed my eyes and let the calm in. Whatever came next, I was ready. The next morning, a letter arrived from the IRS confirming an appointment for my official statement. My stomach tightened as I read the date. It felt strange seeing something so serious in black and white, but I didn't flinch. I gathered my documents, checked the flash drive twice, and laid out my clothes for the meeting. I wanted to look steady, not like a frightened old woman. For months, I'd lived in confusion and fear. Now I was walking straight into the truth. Whatever the outcome, it would finally be mine to face on my own terms. When I arrived at the IRS office, the waiting room was quiet, except for the hum of the air conditioner. The agent, a kind woman named Lewis, greeted me with a firm handshake. She thanked me for cooperating and led me to a small interview room. I handed her everything: emails, bank statements, recordings. She went through them carefully, her expression tightening as she read. After an hour, she looked up and said softly, "You did the right thing." Those words hit me harder than I expected. For the first time in a long time, I believed them. After giving my statement, I walked outside into the bright sunlight. It felt like stepping out of a long, dark tunnel. The air smelled clean, and for a moment, I just stood there breathing it in. I knew the investigation would take time, but I also knew something irreversible had begun. Justice wasn't instant, but it had started moving. On the ride home, I stared out the window at passing streets, realizing how much of life keeps going, even when your world falls apart. The thought didn't make me sad. It made me feel grounded again. Back home, I sat in my favorite chair with a cup of tea and listened to the house settle around me. Every sound, the creak of wood, the hum of the refrigerator, felt familiar again, like the home had been waiting for me to come back to myself. I thought about Frank, about how proud he'd be to see me stand up for the truth. I whispered to the empty room, "I did it." Saying it out loud made it real. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful, like the end of a storm. That evening, Emma called again. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail saying she wanted to make things right, but her voice sounded hollow, more desperate than sincere. I deleted it without listening to the end. The line between forgiveness and weakness had become clear to me now. I couldn't keep saving someone who didn't want to change. I wasn't cruel about it. I was done. That kind of quiet strength was new to me, but it felt good, almost freeing. I finally understood that letting go wasn't punishment. It was protection. A week later, 2 officers arrived at my door. They showed me a warrant related to the investigation and asked if I knew Emma's whereabouts. I told them I hadn't seen her since she left in anger. They thanked me politely and left. I watched their car pull away and felt a strange calm settle in, I wasn't shocked or heartbroken anymore. I'd already lost her months ago, long before any of this became official. Watching justice move forward didn't hurt. It felt like closure, even if the ending wasn't the one I'd hoped for. The next morning, I received another call from Agent Lewis. She said Emma had been taken in for questioning. My hand trembled slightly as I thanked her for the update. When I hung up, I walked to the window and watched the sunrise. I should have felt relief, but what I felt instead was grief. Grief for the daughter I thought I knew, for the family we used to be. The world outside looked calm, but inside me, there was a quiet mourning. Some losses don't make noise. They just sit inside you, heavy and permanent. That evening, I sat in the kitchen, staring at the cup of tea that had gone cold. I thought about how strange life is, how the people you love most can become the source of your deepest pain. Yet even as I thought about Emma, part of me still wanted her to be okay. I didn't wish her harm. I just wanted her to learn. That's the cruel part about being a mother. You can see the worst in your child and still hope they find their way back. That hope never really dies. It just grows quieter. A few days later, I got another call from the IRS. They said new evidence showed Emma's husband was behind most of the transfers. He'd manipulated her into signing documents and using my identity. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or angry. The betrayal was still hers too, but now I saw it differently. Maybe she wasn't the villain I thought she was. Maybe she was a victim of her own weakness. Either way, the truth didn't undo the damage. It just made the picture clearer. Some clarity hurts more than ignorance ever did. That night, I sat in my living room, staring at the postcard Emma had written as a teenager. "I'll always take care of you," it said. I held it between my fingers until the paper felt thin. I realized those words weren't a promise. They were a wish. She had wanted to be good back then. Maybe she still could be. But wishes and reality rarely match. I placed the postcard back in the drawer, not out of sentiment, but out of mercy. Even broken promises deserve a place to rest. The next morning, Agent Lewis called again. She said Emma might avoid jail time if I agreed to cooperate on a settlement. My first instinct was to refuse, but then she added that Emma had confessed and was trying to make amends. I told her I needed time to think. After hanging up, I sat in silence, staring at the teacup on the table. I'd fought so hard for justice, but now I had to decide whether I wanted punishment or peace. The two didn't always come together, and peace suddenly seemed more valuable than revenge. That day passed slowly. I cleaned the house, organized the kitchen drawers, and tried to imagine what Frank would have advised. He always believed in second chances, even when people didn't deserve them. I wasn't sure if that was wisdom or foolishness. By evening, I walked out onto the porch and watched the streetlights flicker on. I thought about what mercy really meant, whether it was a gift to others or to ourselves. The more I thought about it, the more I realized forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It just stops it from controlling you. The next morning, I called Agent Lewis back. I told her I was willing to consider a settlement if Emma took full responsibility and agreed to repay every cent. There was a pause on the other end before she said, "That's fair." I hung up feeling lighter. I didn't forgive Emma to excuse her. I did it to set myself free. Holding on to anger had kept me tied to her lies. Letting go meant stepping outside that circle. For the first time, I felt like the story wasn't about loss anymore. It was about reclaiming my peace. That afternoon, Emma called. Her voice was quiet, humble, in a way I'd never heard before. She thanked me for not pressing charges and said she was willing to repay everything. She didn't ask for forgiveness. Maybe she knew better. I listened in silence as she talked. And when she finished, I said only, "Do what's right this time." Then I hung up. There were no tears, no goodbyes, just finality. Some endings don't need closure. They just need truth. And I finally had mine. That night, I found myself reading through my old journal. So many pages were filled with fear, doubt, and confusion. But at the end, I added one more line. Sometimes strength isn't standing tall, it's standing alone. I closed the book and smiled faintly. The words didn't make me feel sad. They felt like a quiet promise to myself, a reminder that even the worst storms can leave behind clear skies. My life wasn't over. It was just beginning again, this time on my terms. If you're wondering how this could possibly end, you're not alone. Stay with me, because what happened next changed everything. A week later, I received a letter from Emma's lawyer confirming the settlement. She'd agreed to repay the full amount in installments and attend mandatory financial counseling. I folded the paper and placed it in a small box beside my husband's old watch. It wasn't justice in the dramatic sense, but it was accountability. That was enough. I looked out the window at the quiet street and realized how much calmer everything felt now. I'd fought the battle I needed to fight, and I had won, not with anger, but with persistence and truth. The following month, I met Emma for the first time since everything happened. We sat in a public park, a safe distance between us. She looked thinner, older somehow, as if the lies had finally caught up to her. She said she was sorry, over and over, but I didn't respond. I just listened. She told me she'd left her husband and was trying to rebuild her life. I nodded quietly. I didn't hate her anymore, but I didn't trust her either. Some things can be forgiven, but not repaired, and I could live with that. As we sat there, she started crying, saying she wished she could undo everything. I told her softly that life doesn't give us that option. All we can do is live differently going forward. She looked down, ashamed. The silence between us felt heavy but necessary. I realized I didn't need her to suffer. I just needed her to understand what she'd done. When she finally looked up, I could see regret in her eyes. Maybe that was enough. Maybe remorse was the first real step toward her own redemption. After that meeting, I walked home alone, taking the long route through the quiet streets. The air smelled of rain, and for once, it didn't feel lonely. It felt peaceful. I thought about how strange it was to lose something so big and still come out stronger. My savings, my trust, my illusions, they were gone. But in their place, I'd found something better. I'd found myself again. When I reached home, I brewed tea, sat by the window, and smiled. The world outside was calm, and for the first time in years, so was I. A few days later, I received the first installment of repayment from Emma's account. The amount wasn't large, but it was something. I didn't celebrate or cry. I just placed the check in a drawer and went about my day. I wasn't waiting for the money to make things right. I'd already done that myself. The payment was just a symbol, a reminder that even broken things can be rebuilt, piece by piece. Sometimes healing doesn't come as a wave. It comes in small, quiet moments, when you realize you've finally stopped hurting. With time, I began volunteering at a local community center. They held weekly meetings to help seniors protect themselves from scams and fraud. I told my story anonymously, focusing on what I learned rather than what I lost. The people who attended often thanked me afterward, saying my words gave them courage. That meant more to me than any refund could. My pain had turned into something useful, something that might save someone else from making the same mistake, that gave all of it meaning again. Mr. Lyle visited me one afternoon with a plate of cookies. He smiled and said I seemed happier. I laughed and told him, maybe I finally understood life's lesson a little too late, he said. Better late than never. His words warmed me. For so long, I had carried shame like a shadow, but now it was gone. I didn't need anyone's validation anymore. The quiet I used to fear had become my peace. Even the ticking clock in the hallway sounded softer now, like time itself had forgiven me. A few months passed, and I decided to sell my house. It held too many memories, some good, some heavy. I found a smaller place nearby, with a sunny kitchen and a little garden. Moving there felt like shedding an old skin. The neighbors were kind, and the mornings were filled with birds instead of worries. Every sunrise felt like a reminder that life doesn't end with loss. It reshapes itself, and in that reshaping, you find new reasons to wake up, new ways to live without fear. Emma kept her promise, sending payments every month. She also sent letters, simple, handwritten notes about her new job, her progress in therapy, her attempts to start fresh. I read them all, but replied only once, saying, I wish you well. It wasn't distance out of bitterness. It was distance out of peace. Sometimes love means letting go enough to let someone rebuild without you watching. I'd learned that silence can be a form of grace, too. By the end of that year, I realized my life had settled into something simple and beautiful. I cooked, gardened, and spent evenings reading. The past no longer haunted me. It had become a story I'd already survived. When people asked if I was lonely, I smiled and said no. I had enough. Enough peace, enough purpose, enough self-respect to last whatever years I had left. The truth had taken a lot from me, but it gave me back something far more valuable: my freedom. The seasons changed quietly, and I found myself settling into a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. Mornings started with tea in the garden, afternoons with long walks to the market. I still thought about Emma sometimes, but not with anger anymore, just reflection. Pain had turned into memory, and memory had softened into understanding. Life wasn't about erasing what happened. It was about living fully despite it. I didn't need to rebuild the past. I just needed to grow something new in its place. And for the first time, I finally was. One afternoon, I visited the senior center again. They asked if I could speak to a new group about financial safety. I stood before a small room of older faces, some anxious, some curious. I told them my story, not with bitterness, but with calm honesty. When I finished, a woman in the back wiped her eyes and said, "You just saved someone's life today." Her words made my throat tighten. I had spent months feeling ashamed, but in that moment, I realized my story had become something bigger than my pain. It had become a warning wrapped in hope. That night, I sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker across the pavement. I thought about Frank again, about how he always believed everything happens for a reason. For so long, I doubted that idea. But now I could finally see what he meant. Sometimes life breaks you open, so that light can get in through the cracks. My loss wasn't meaningless. It was just a hard way of learning. I smiled faintly, whispering to the night that I was doing fine. And this time, I meant it. A few weeks later, I received another letter from Emma. This one was longer than the rest. She wrote about her therapy sessions, how she was learning to face her mistakes. She said she finally understood the pain she caused, and hoped I could forgive her one day, even if we never became close again. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside my journal. I didn't write back. Forgiveness, I realized, doesn't always need an announcement. Sometimes it's just a quiet decision you make alone, and I had already made mine. One Sunday morning, I attended church for the first time in years. The sermon was about second chances. I sat in the back, listening as sunlight streamed through stained glass, coloring the floor with soft blues and reds. The pastor said that grace isn't given to erase the past, but to give people courage to face it. I felt tears in my eyes, not from sadness, but from release. For so long, I'd carried everything alone. Now it felt like I could finally set it down and walk forward without fear. After the service, I walked home through the park. Children were playing, couples laughing, and life went on around me like it always had. I realized I wasn't watching from the outside anymore. I was part of it again. The world hadn't changed, but I had. I no longer measured my worth by what I'd lost, but by how I'd survived it. That shift felt like freedom. I stopped by a bakery, bought myself a small slice of cake, and smiled at the simple joy of it. Survival could taste sweet when you'd earned it. That evening, I was sitting on the porch when the distant church bell rang. Its sound rolled across the neighborhood, slow and deep, like it was reminding me of everything I'd endured. I closed my eyes and listened, letting it wash over me. It didn't sound like sorrow anymore. It sounded like closure. Every toll felt like a heartbeat syncing with mine. I thought about how far I'd come, from fear to peace, from silence to strength. The bell kept ringing, and I kept breathing, steady and calm. The past had finally stopped echoing. Later that night, I opened my drawer and took out two things: the postcard Emma had written years ago, and the envelope containing her latest payment. I placed them side by side on the table. One represented a promise made in innocence, the other a debt born from betrayal. Together, they told the story of who we became. I didn't feel bitterness anymore, just acceptance. The love that once blinded me had turned into wisdom, and wisdom had turned into peace. That was enough for me. Some stories don't need revenge, they just need resolution. I decided to frame that postcard, and hang it in my hallway, not as a reminder of pain, but as proof that even broken promises have meaning. Every time I passed it, I thought about how love can change shape and still remain love in some small way. It didn't erase what she did, but it reminded me of who I was. A mother who gave, a woman who survived, a person who learned. The postcard no longer hurt to look at. It simply belonged to my story, and I had finally made peace with that. Days turned into months again. Quiet and steady. I started tending a small garden behind my new home. Roses, lavender, and mint. Simple things that made the air smell alive. Gardening taught me patience all over again. You can't rush growth. You nurture it, trust it, and let time do its work. That lesson mirrored my own healing. Some days I still thought of Emma, wondering how she was, but instead of sadness, I just whispered a wish for her peace. Even if we were apart, I hoped she found the same calm that I finally had. One afternoon, I received a call from the community center. They wanted to honor me at a local event for my volunteer work. I laughed, thinking how ironic it was that my biggest mistake had turned into something worth celebrating. The woman on the phone said I'd helped dozens of people recognize fraud before it happened. That made me smile. My story had started with silence, but it ended with voice, mine, finally steady, finally heard. I agreed to attend, not for recognition, but because I wanted to show others that healing doesn't mean hiding. At the event, the audience was small but kind. As I stood on stage, they handed me a certificate and some flowers. I thanked them and said a few words about what I'd learned. I told them that trust is precious but not blind, that love can exist alongside boundaries, and that it's never too late to start over. The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was warm. I felt proud, not because I'd been strong, but because I'd learned strength the hard way. That kind of lesson stays with you forever. After the ceremony, I stepped outside into the cool evening air. The sky was painted in shades of gold and violet, and for a moment, everything felt perfectly still. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything I'd survived. The wind brushed against my face, like a soft reminder that life moves forward, whether we're ready or not. This time, I was ready. I had faced the worst and come out whole. That realization was worth more than any apology or restitution could ever bring. A few weeks later, I got another letter from Emma. This one was different. It wasn't about payments or progress. It was simply a note saying she had found a small apartment, started a new job, and was taking care of herself. She said she hoped I was proud of her. I read it twice, then placed it next to the postcard on the wall. I didn't cry. I just smiled softly. Pride didn't come easy after everything. But maybe this time, she had earned a small piece of it. People can change. I'd seen proof. Life continued peacefully after that. I kept writing in my journal, kept teaching others about trust and boundaries, and kept finding joy in small things. I realized that happiness doesn't return all at once. It rebuilds slowly, piece by piece, until one day you realize it's been there all along. The pain no longer defined me. It had simply become a chapter in a much longer story, one that still had room for hope, laughter, and quiet mornings filled with light. That was all I ever wanted in the end. Peace that stayed. Winter came again, gentle and calm. Snow dusted the rooftops outside my window, and everything looked clean and still. I made myself tea and wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. For a long moment, I just sat there, grateful for the silence. I thought about how fear had once filled this same space, how every sound used to make me uneasy. Now the quiet felt like company. Healing isn't loud, it's the slow return of peace to the places where pain once lived. In my home, my heart was finally full of peace again. One morning, I found a small box at my doorstep. Inside was a framed photograph. Emma and me from years ago, smiling in the garden. A note was attached. For everything you taught me, even the hard lessons. I held it for a long time, my eyes stinging but dry. I placed it beside the postcard and letter on the shelf. The three items together felt complete, like the full circle of our story. Some bonds don't break. They bend, stretch, and reshape, but they still hold, quietly, in their own imperfect way. As days passed, I found myself thinking less about what was lost and more about what remained. I still had my memories, my strength, and a sense of clarity that no one could take away. I'd lived long enough to understand that life doesn't owe us fairness, it just gives us moments to decide who we'll be after everything falls apart. I chose to be whole again. That choice didn't erase the past, but it turned it into wisdom, and wisdom, I learned, is its own kind of grace. That spring, the community garden held its opening day. I brought a small rose bush to plant, the same kind Frank once loved. As I knelt to place it in the soil, I felt his presence beside me, not in sadness, but in quiet pride. Around me, neighbors laughed, children played, and life moved forward. I pressed my hands into the earth, grounding myself in that moment. Growth takes time, but it always returns, even after the harshest winter. As I stood up, I smiled at the sunlight, breaking through the clouds. It felt like a promise kept. Weeks later, I received an invitation from the local library asking if I would write a short piece for their newsletter about overcoming loss. I agreed, and titled it, What Trust Taught Me. Writing it felt like closing the last page of a long chapter. I didn't write about Emma by name. I wrote about love, mistakes, and resilience. When the article was published, several people sent letters thanking me. Each note reminded me that sharing our pain helps others heal too. My story had started in silence, but ended by giving others a voice. The following month, I visited the park where Emma and I last spoke. The same bench was there, shaded by the same tree. I sat for a while, listening to the sound of leaves rustling above. It didn't hurt to be there anymore. It felt like visiting an old chapter of my life, important, but finished. I whispered a small prayer for her, not for forgiveness, but for peace. She would have to live her truth now, just as I had learned to live mine. The wind carried my words away, soft and steady, like closure itself. As I walked home, I passed the bakery again and stopped to buy another small slice of cake. The same clerk smiled and said, "You've got a glow about you today." I laughed, saying maybe it was just good lighting. But deep down, I knew it was something else. It was peace, the kind that comes after surviving storms you thought would destroy you. I carried the cake home, sat by the window, and took a slow bite. It tasted simple, sweet, and alive, just like the life I'd fought to reclaim. Later that evening, I received a letter from the volunteer group saying they were naming their new outreach program after me, the Helen Initiative. I stared at the letter for a long time, overwhelmed. My pain had turned into something that would protect others. I smiled and whispered, "Frank, we did it." Somewhere deep inside, I could almost feel his laughter, warm and approving. All the years of fear, shame, and betrayal had led to this purpose. It was proof that even the hardest stories could end with light. The next morning, I stood at my window as the sun rose over the neighborhood. The light spilled into my kitchen, soft and golden. I thought about everything that had happened. The lies, the heartbreak, the redemption. Somehow, all of it had shaped me into someone stronger, wiser, and free. I wasn't defined by what I'd lost, but by what I'd become. I whispered a quiet thank you to the world, not for the pain, but for the strength it gave me. Some endings don't need grand gestures, just peace. And I had it at last. That evening, as the sky turned orange and gold, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea and watched the world slow down. The air was still, the streets calm, and for the first time, I felt completely at ease. My story had begun with trust broken and ended with trust rebuilt, not in others, but in myself. I smiled softly, thinking of everything and everyone that had brought me here. Life wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and that I realized was the truest kind of peace there is.